The last day of death row, inmate Matthew Johnson. He burned her alive. Justice after 13 years. Hello friends. Tonight we bring you a story that shook an entire community in Texas and continues to echo with pain more than a decade later. It is the story of Nancy Harris, a 76-year-old grandmother loved by her family and neighbors, whose life was stolen in the most harrowing way imaginable inside a small convenience store in Garland. At the center of this case is Matthew Johnson, a man whose descent into addiction and desperation ended with him walking into that store carrying lighter fluid and leaving behind devastation that no family should ever endure. After years on death row, Johnson has now faced his final moments inside Huntsville's execution chamber, exactly 13 years after the day that changed so many lives forever. Stay with us until the end as we uncover his troubled past, the crime, the courtroom battles, his last hours, and the haunting truth of justice served. Don't forget to subscribe to Deathwatch Diaries for more prison documentary stories. Matthew Johnson grew up in Dallas, and from the very start, his life was overshadowed by instability and poor guidance. As early as 7 years old, he was already experimenting with marijuana, a shocking beginning for a child whose peers were still playing ball and riding bikes. By the time he reached high school, Johnson had moved on to harder drugs like crack and PCP, substances that would grip him tightly for the rest of his life. Those who knew him during his teenage years recall a young man who seemed constantly on edge, driven by cravings he could not control. At 19, he tried to anchor himself by marrying his partner, Daphne, but his escalating addiction only deepened. At one point, a friend had to literally tie him to a bed because his drug-fueled mania had become so dangerous. The seeds of his eventual downfall were sown early, but for a time it seemed like Johnson might escape his demons. In 2004, Matthew Johnson's chaotic lifestyle reached a breaking point. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison for a robbery committed while under the influence. Prison, however, temporarily forced him into sobriety. During those years behind bars, he showed signs of improvement. He stayed clean, adjusted his behavior, and even enrolled in parenting courses. Upon his release in 2009, Johnson appeared to be turning a corner. He remained drug-free for several years, gained employment at a mechanic shop where he was eventually promoted, and even welcomed another child into his family. To those around him, it looked as though he was finally stepping into a more stable and responsible chapter of life. But addiction is a shadow that rarely loosens its grip. By 20, after he and Daphne bought their first home and she lost her job, financial stress pushed him back toward old habits. He relapsed, and with that relapse came the spiral into a darkness that would forever change not only his life, but the lives of everyone around him. It was the morning of May 20th, 2012 in Garland, a quiet suburb northeast of Dallas. The Fano Whippin convenience store opened its doors as usual, and behind the counter was Nancy Harris, a 76-year-old grandmother beloved by her family and known by neighbors for her kindness and warmth. For Nancy, it was an ordinary workday. For Matthew Johnson, it was the beginning of a nightmare. Johnson entered the store with a bottle of lighter fluid and a lighter hidden on him. Witnesses later said he seemed detached, focused, but not frantic. He walked directly to Nancy, confronted her behind the counter, and without warning poured lighter fluid over her head. In that instant, Nancy's life was in his hands. Johnson demanded that she open the cash register. As she tried desperately to comply, he stole lighters from the display, cigarettes, and even her ring small, petty items taken as if her life meant nothing. Once the register opened, he grabbed the money, but rather than leaving, Johnson flicked a lighter. Nancy Harris was set ablaze. The flames consumed her in seconds. In agony, she ran toward a sink, trying desperately to douse the fire that covered her face. Chest, arms, and legs, Johnson, showing chilling indifference, walked out of the store calmly, even stopping to grab candy on his way out. He stripped off his clothes as he fled through nearby neighborhoods. Police captured him within the hour. When confronted, he sneered at the officers, mocking them by saying, "What took you so long? You're getting slow." It was a callous remark that revealed a man already far removed from the gravity of what he had done. Nancy Harris was rushed to the hospital with 2nd to 4th degree burns, covering 40% of her body. Her injuries were catastrophic. Despite the doctor's best efforts, the damage was too severe. For 5 long days, her family kept vigil, hoping against hope. But on May 25, 2012, they made the heartbreaking decision to remove life support. Nancy left behind 4 sons: John, Brian, Scott, and Chris, as well as grandchildren who adored her. In court, her family's grief was palpable, and her community rallied in outrage and sorrow. The senselessness of her death shocked Garland to its core. Matthew Johnson confessed soon after his arrest. He admitted to setting Nancy Harris on fire, though he insisted that he had not intended to kill her, only to scare her. His defense argued that he had been high on drugs and alcohol, incapable of fully controlling his actions. Witnesses spoke about his role as a father and his attempts at sobriety in the past. The prosecution, however, painted a stark picture. They highlighted Johnson's long criminal history, his relapse into addiction, and most importantly, the brutality of his actions that morning. The theft of petty items, the deliberate act of setting a grandmother on fire, and his mocking attitude during his arrest left jurors with little doubt. In 2013, Johnson was sentenced to death. Over the next 12 years, Matthew Johnson's life unfolded within the walls of Texas death row. He filed multiple appeals, challenging everything from the handling of his trial to the timing of his execution dates. In 2004, the United States Supreme Court rejected his final appeal. His last hope came just 2 days before his execution, when the Fifth Circuit Court dismissed his claims that the Texas Attorney General had improperly influenced the schedule of executions. While awaiting his fate, Johnson reportedly attempted to change. He completed a faith-based program and maintained contact with his wife and daughters, urging them not to follow his path of addiction. His attorney stated that Johnson was deeply remorseful for what he had done and never tried to claim innocence. But remorse could not undo what had been done, and the courts remained unmoved. On May 20th, 2025, exactly 13 years after Nancy Harris's death, Matthew Johnson was scheduled to die. That morning, he woke inside his cell in Huntsville's Walls unit, knowing that the day he had dreaded for over a decade had finally arrived. Johnson declined a special last meal. Texas had ended the tradition in 2011 after another inmate had abused the privilege. Reports say Johnson requested ice cream, but was denied under current rules. Instead, he ate the standard prison meal offered that day. Throughout his final hours, Johnson spent time in prayer and quiet reflection. His attorney described him as calm, resigned, and accepting of the fate that awaited him. He was given the opportunity to speak final words, but chose silence. At 6 in the evening, he was led into the execution chamber, strapped onto the gurney, and injected with the lethal drugs. Within minutes, his chest stopped rising. At 20 minutes past 6 in the evening, officials pronounced him dead. Dear friends, as the sun set over Huntsville on May 20th, 2020, Matthew Johnson's story reached its final chapter. Tonight, we remember Nancy Harris not for the way her life ended, but for the love she shared with her family and community. Thank you for watching, and please subscribe to Deathwatch Diaries for more prison documentary stories that reveal the human cost of crime.